Gosh, that feels like quite a series of acts to follow. And I think what you're going to hear as I'm speaking is really touching on quite a lot of the themes that we've just heard. And that's largely because, we're kind of working in the same universe and community of practice, and so I hope we're taking a kind of shared evidence base forward. But it's also because we've actually had a lot of collaboration with Sarah's colleagues in the Bank of England, with other central banks, and with other financial institutions, including through climate asset managers. So you're going to hear a little bit of a reprise, I think, of some of the themes that you've just heard from others, but what may be the kind of additional layer that I can put on this is just thinking about how we've been trying to kind of curate and take some of the incredible work that we've been hearing about into some really big nature conversations internationally. So maybe just taking a couple of steps back just in terms of our journey within DEFRA about thinking about the role of nature and the economy. So in 2019, as you know, the UK government commissioned Partha Dasgupta to review the economics of biodiversity. And for me, this is a kind of really path-breaking report that's equivalent to the Stern Review in terms of really trying to think very carefully around the relationship between our economics, between our economy, as we've just been talking about, and nature. And for me, the kind of standout sort of takeaway from that was to remind us that, of course, our economies don't sit in some magical place off some other planet that's separate from nature, but rather our economies are embedded within nature. And I think that's quite an important sort of shift in our mindset. And that the importance of that shift becomes really clear when we understand the rate at which we're depleting that natural capital. And we've heard some of the numbers around that, but they are pretty stark. Between 1992 and 2014, the global value of natural capital stocks declined by 40%. That's pretty worrying in terms of our level of reliance on nature. So what's going to happen if we're reducing that natural capital? So Dasgupta really provided us with that very stark reminder that nature, or natural capital, if you will, isn't just like a nice-to-have pretty black backcloth to our lives. It's absolutely fundamental to our economic and financial systems. So, of course, it's important to note that, you know, we might all have been reading Dasgupta and saying, gosh, that's all really new and interesting. But, of course, for most of human history, we actually understood that. And Indigenous people around the world have helped to kind of carry that understanding and retain it for us over the centuries during which we've forgotten it. But what I think Dasgupta helped us to do was to really provide a bit of a bridge between contemporary economics and financial thinking and the science of biodiversity, and really helping us to kind of re-embed our thinking in nature. And I think what you've heard just now is kind of helping to reinforce is that message is really becoming quite mainstream now. I think it's gone quite quickly from being a sort of bit of a niche sport to now kind of accelerating and kind of sitting, if not kind of as an equal to climate, certainly as a kind of growing younger sibling. And that's really timely because what we're seeing is that a number of multilateral agreements are helping to really kind of pick up some of those threads and carry them forward into sort of international policy. So down the road in Glasgow in November last year, we were lucky enough to be part of the UK COP presidency team, which I think really helped to put nature at the heart of the climate debates with a particular focus on forests. And as others have referred to, we're now working towards COP 15.2, which will happen in Montreal in December, where we may or we may not end up with a similar apex target that we've got under net zero. But certainly what we're hoping for is that Montreal provides a sort of Paris moment for nature. And just thinking about just sort of back over the past year and then forward into Montreal, I just wanted to make sort of three points, which I think, again, will kind of echo what some of the other speakers have said. So I think the first thing is not to think about nature as this new and additional thing that's separate from climate. And I think this message that's come out that we need to really integrate our thinking between climate and nature is incredibly important to take forward. Even if we switched off all of our fossil fuels tomorrow, we would not be able to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating unless we halt and reverse nature loss. And I think one of the things too that came out during the conversation a little bit on the nature piece, but less so I'd say on the earlier climate discussion, is that as we're thinking about future climate policy, we really need to be putting the food production system much more firmly at the core of our thinking. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about within GEFI as we're doing that, particularly in our international work, is what do we do about the food system? And one of the key areas where we worked quite hard last year was to think about how we start to decouple agricultural production from deforestation and land use conversion. And we've been working quite actively with a range of stakeholders to ensure that integration of nature into climate risk. So one of the things we've been thinking about is kind of working with WBCSD, who's been working on updating the TCFD guidance to strengthen it for the agriculture, forest and land use structure system. What we've also seen in the press this week is a growing conversation about the position of nature in transition plans, which have been mentioned. And particularly, we've put a lot of effort into thinking about how we decouple agricultural production from deforestation. At COP26, we saw 33 financial institutions with around $9 trillion of asset under management committing to transition their portfolios away from activities that are linked to deforestation. We saw over 140 governments commit to a goal to halt and reverse deforestation loss by 2030 and to align private financial flows with that goal. And what we're hoping for is that by COP27, the number of FIs that will have signed up to that deforestation commitment will have increased, and we're hoping to sort of be able to report a series of actions by governments to support their commitments that came out of Glasgow. So secondly, the second key message is that, yes, there are things that nature does that are not purely relating to climate regulation, and we need to recognize and value those so that we know, for example, the $5 trillion tourism industry wouldn't look quite the same without nature's beauty. I don't really want to go on holiday to kind of, depleted oceans and ragged mountains. We also know that the $9 trillion food industry would look rather different without pollinators and without the soil biome, and where would the pharmaceutical industry get its next generation of drugs without nature? And I think what we're beginning to see, and this has been referred to too, is a real sort of movement in terms of understanding the nature of the risk posed by nature loss and action to mitigate that. So we've seen really important reports that Sarah referred to coming out from the NGFS, from the Coalition of Finance Ministers, really beginning to highlight the magnitude of that risk. And until you recognise there's a problem, we're not going to be able to act upon it. So we've been really delighted to work with Sarah's team on this new piece of work to assess the level of risk that nature loss poses for the UK economy. And we're keen to sort of be learning from other jurisdictions, including from Holland, France, and Malaysia, which I know is represented here from the findings of their work. And then, of course, we, along with others, have been active parts of that community supporting TNFD. I think the final thing I just wanted to say was that it's easy for us to focus a lot on risk, and I think there are really good reasons why we do that, and there's really good reason to be thinking particularly around the data, strengthening the data to better measure that risk. But I think it is really important, and we touched on this in the last bit of the conversation, around what's the opportunity here. And a recent report for the G20, by UNEP, estimated that G20 countries alone will need something in the region of $285 billion a year of investment by 2050 in order to meet their kind of biodiversity, climate, and land degradation targets. So there's a big opportunity here, and again, we've been working with climate asset managers as part of the Natural Climate Investment Alliance, among others, going into COP26, to think about how we can really scale investment in the sort of nature economy. We're also seeing growth in initiatives through on the carbon market side. So LEAF was a really important innovation that was launched at COP26. And so I guess kind of my big message is that on that side is I think the international policy discussions that are happening are beginning to create even more space for those investments to follow. So just to summarise, I think it's clear just in the presence of such a sort of august panel earlier on that we are making real progress. There's a lot to report on. I do think that the CBD COP in Montreal does have this potential to help to shape an apex target. It won't necessarily deliver it in its own right, but I think this challenge around how you articulate what is inside the nature positive bucket is going to be a really big one, and I think there's a lot of work going on that will help us to define that quite quickly. What we do know is that delivering on all the words that are delivered by many governments around the world when we all meet together and talk a lot and negotiate very hard, is that to deliver those commitments on the ground will require help from all of you. It will require trillions of dollars of private finance to be aligned with that vision of a net zero and a nature positive future. But I think the encouraging bit is that we're not starting from scratch and that we can really learn from the work that's already happened on the climate side. We're building a lot of the tools, whether it's TNFD, whether it's SBTN and SBTI. And I think the last point that came out very strongly again from the panel is this thing about partnerships. We've been really fortunate to work with a very rich range of partners around the world in the last year or so. And I think what we're going to see is those partnerships thickening between financial institutions, regulators, policymakers, and academics, because it's clearly only that way that we're going to make progress. Many thanks.